There are lives in which the hand of providence appears not as a distant whisper, but as a force that bends the very direction of nations. Peter Canisius lived in such an age and bore such a weight. His life unfolded at a moment when the Catholic world shook at its foundations, when kingdoms cracked beneath the strain of religious revolt, and when universities, pulpits, and even monasteries seemed to sway in the storm. Yet from the chaos rose a man whose serenity seemed impossible, whose firmness seemed beyond natural strength, and whose mind burned with clarity that many believed could only have come from God. To read his life is to watch a single soul push back against an age determined to lose itself, not with sword or crown, but with prayer, with intellect, and with a love so fierce it steadied entire nations. Peter Canisius was born on May 8th, 1521, in the city of Nijmegen, then part of the Duchy of Gelders. His father, Jacob Canis, was a respected magistrate, wealthy, influential, a man whose voice mattered in civic affairs. His mother, Egidia van Houweningen, died when Peter was still young, leaving him with a wound of longing that would never entirely close. There are not many stories of his childhood preserved, but the flashes that remain paint a picture of a boy unusually serious for his age, drawn instinctively toward the church, and carry within him a sense of purpose he could not yet name. He studied at the University of Cologne while still in his teens, and it was there that the true shape of his soul began to reveal itself. Cologne in the 1530s was no quiet university town. It was a battlefield of ideas, a place where Lutheran preachers challenged Catholic professors in taverns and public squares, where pamphlets flew like sparks from fire, and where students found themselves caught in the crosswinds of a spiritual war. Peter entered this world with an earnest desire for learning, but beneath that desire lay a deeper trembling. He felt the atmosphere of doubt, of rebellion, of religious fragmentation, and it stirred in him both fear and a strange, urgent calling. One story from these years whispers of a moment that changed him. Peter had been struggling with competing voices, some urging him toward success and recognition in the academic world, others whispering of a more hidden path. He found himself drawn, almost inexplicably, to the Carthusian monastery of St. Barbara in Cologne. There, amid the stillness of stone corridors and the sound of distant chanting, something in him awakened. He knelt before the tomb of blessed Peter Faber, the gentle and brilliant Jesuit, whom many believed to be a living vessel of God's tenderness. As Peter Canisius prayed, he felt a clarity rise within him, not a voice, not a vision, but a certainty. God was calling him not to a career, but to himself. This interior stirring became even stronger when he met the Jesuits directly, the small, young, fragile group founded by Ignatius of Loyola only a few years earlier. They arrived in Cologne in 1543, little known, often misunderstood, but ablaze with purpose. Peter was captivated. Their simplicity, their discipline, their joy and sacrifice. He felt that each Jesuit carried a spark of what he felt in the quiet of St. Barbara's monastery. He sought counsel, prayed intensely, and spent long hours wrestling with fears. For he knew what joining them meant. It meant surrendering all prospects of worldly advancement, giving up the path his father had imagined for him, and embracing a life of poverty, obedience, and unending labor for the Church. During this interior struggle, Peter experienced what he later called profound grace. One night, exhausted by indecision, he laid his head upon the desk in his small student room, lit only by a dying candle. As he drifted into sleep, he felt as though a warm presence enveloped him, filling him with peace. When he awoke, he could not describe the experience precisely. It was not a dream, not a vision in any formal sense. It was rather a sense of being held, of being strengthened beyond what any human comfort could give. He attributed it directly to God, and from that moment his doubts dissolved like mist before the sun. On May 8th, 1543, his 22nd birthday, Peter Canisius entered the Society of Jesus as its first Dutch member. His father was confused, disappointed, even wounded by the decision, but Peter did not waver. He had found his path, and almost immediately, the demands of that path began. His first mission was not glamorous. Peter was sent to work with poor students, teaching them the basics of faith, helping them resist the pull of heretical teachers, and taking on tasks no academic-minded young man of his background would have welcomed. But he embraced each duty with an eagerness that startled those around him. He seemed to believe that every moment mattered, even sweeping a classroom, even comforting a struggling student. And in this spirit, he began to radiate a strength that others instinctively trusted. His academic brilliance, however, could not remain hidden. Within 2 years, he became deeply involved in the University of Cologne as a defender of Catholic orthodoxy. The city council invited him repeatedly to speak against Protestant influences infiltrating the university, and the more he spoke, the more people realized that this young Jesuit possessed an extraordinary combination of clarity, gentleness, and unwavering conviction. It was around this time that Peter experienced another mystical moment, one that left a mark on his entire life. Preparing for his final vows, he prayed intensely for the grace to love Christ with a heart entirely purified of self-interest. During this prayer, he felt in his soul what he later described as the most profound and intimate nearness of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. It was as though Christ placed his heart upon Peter's own. The experience filled him with such love that he wept uncontrollably, and from that day forward, he carried within him a fire that seemed inexhaustible. His superiors recognized that fire immediately, and as the tensions of the Reformation grew sharper, the Church needed not soldiers, but brilliant, holy minds who could teach, preach, and win hearts back through truth and charity. Peter Canisius was given missions more difficult than most men could endure. Yet he never resisted. When asked to go to the Council of Trent as a theologian and advisor, he agreed without hesitation, though he knew he would be navigating politics as fierce as any battlefield. He traveled to Trent in late 1547, a young priest surrounded by seasoned bishops, cardinaligates, imperial envoys, and scholars whose reputations stretched across Europe. And yet from the very beginning, he carried himself with such humility and such transparent holiness that even men decades older listened to him with respect. His role was not to speak in the central debates. He was too young for that, but he worked tirelessly behind the scenes, drafting theological summaries, clarifying questions for delegates, preparing texts for debate, and meeting privately with bishops troubled by conflicting pressures from their countries. One scene from the council illustrates his influence. A group of bishops from Germany, overwhelmed by the complexities of the theological controversies raging in their homelands, sought him out one evening in a small room lit by torches. They asked him to explain, piece by piece, the Catholic teaching on justification, the sacraments, and the authority of the Church, topics the Protestants had torn into 1,000 fragments. Peter spoke for hours, not with heated rhetoric, but with the calmness of a man rooted deeply in prayer. The bishops later said that they felt as if they were hearing not only a scholar, but a soul who understood the wounded heart of Europe. His words steadied them during some of the council's most turbulent moments. When he returned from Trent, the Church sent him into the heart of the crisis. Germany, Switzerland, Austria, the very lands where Protestantism had advanced rapidly, and thus began one of the most extraordinary chapters of his life. But before that mission could unfold, he was called to a task that would shape an entire generation, the founding of Jesuit colleges. He worked tirelessly to train young men intellectually, spiritually, and morally, believing that if youth were formed in truth, the faith of nations could be rebuilt. A well-preserved episode from his early teaching years shows the depth of his influence. One night, a young student approached him trembling, burdened by doubts and fears about God's existence, doubts planted by teachers who mocked Christian faith. Peter invited him to walk through the cloister gardens. As they walked beneath the moonlit sky, Peter spoke with the gentleness of a saint, answering questions patiently, acknowledging the young man's fears, and guiding him back, step by step, to trust in God. Years later, the student would say that this single conversation saved my faith and perhaps even my soul. By now, Peter Canisius had become a man impossible to ignore. He was respected by bishops, trusted by popes, admired by students, and feared by heretical preachers who found themselves consistently undone by the clarity of his teaching. Yet through it all, he remained extraordinarily humble. He prayed constantly. He fasted rigorously. He considered himself a servant, not a leader. And though he rarely spoke of mystical graces, those close to him sensed that his strength came from more than intellect. He carried an inner peace, even in moments of crisis, that made people believe he lived in continual union with God. In 1549, Ignatius of Loyola himself summoned Peter to Rome. The Jesuit founder had been observing him from afar, quietly gathering reports of his work. When Peter arrived, Ignatius greeted him with fatherly warmth. The two spoke long into the night about the state of Germany, about the needs of the Church, and about the spiritual formation of the Jesuits. Ignatius had an extraordinary gift for seeing the strengths of each man, and he saw in Peter a rare blend of intellect, zeal, and compassion. It became clear that Ignatius intended to entrust him with the most delicate and demanding missions. And so, after months of preparation and prayer, Ignatius sent him north with a simple but staggering charge: rebuild the Catholic faith in German-speaking lands. Peter accepted without fear. His life was no longer his own. He believed God had shaped him for this mission from the very beginning. Through his early studies, his mystical experiences, his time at Trent, and his years in the classroom. Now, at last, he was ready to step into the storm, and the storm would test everything he had. When Peter Canisius stepped onto German soil in 1550 with Ignatius's blessing, he felt the weight of history pressing upon him. The Germany he returned to was not the one he had left as a young student. Entire parishes had embraced Protestantism. Religious houses stood half deserted. Catholic bishops, confused and intimidated, often lacked confidence or clarity. Many cities, once centers of Catholic devotion, were now arenas of fierce polemic, where preachers hurled accusations across crowded marketplaces. The Church was wounded, bleeding, and bewildered. Peter felt no triumph, no fire or battle lust, but something quieter and more powerful, a burning desire to heal. He saw himself not as a warrior, but as a physician of souls, and the disease before him was widespread, complicated, and deadly. But he also carried something rare, an unshakable hope that God could restore what seemed lost. His first major mission brought him to the Duchy of Bavaria, especially the University of Ingolstadt. The university had once been a fortress of Catholic learning, but now confusion swirled among professors and students alike. Peter walked into this world without fanfare, wearing the simple black robe of a Jesuit, carrying no possessions except his breviary and a few books. Yet his presence changed the atmosphere almost immediately. A story from these early days became legendary. The university rector, concerned about the decline in faith among the students, asked Peter to preach. The chapel was nearly empty when he arrived, but Peter simply knelt, prayed silently for a long moment, and then rose to the pulpit. His voice, when he began, was gentle, almost conversational, but soon the sincerity and clarity of his words drew students from outside. They filled the aisles and the doorways, then the courtyard beyond. For the first time in years, young men felt as if someone understood their confusion. Someone who could explain Catholic teaching not as a dusty collection of rules, but as a living truth capable of touching the heart. By the end of the year, attendance at Mass and confession had doubled. Professors began turning to him for guidance. Even those leaning toward Protestant ideas found themselves softened by his kindness. Peter did not insult or attack. Instead, he explained, invited, and illuminated. His charity became his weapon. It was in Ingolstadt that Peter began working on one of the most influential writings of the entire Catholic Reformation, his catechism. The church had catechisms before, of course, but Peter saw that the youth needed something different, something precise, clear, and deeply rooted in Scripture and tradition. He wrote it painstakingly, often late at night, by candlelight, after full days of teaching and preaching. He wrote with one goal: to restore faith, not through arguing alone, but through beauty and truth. One evening, while writing the section on the Eucharist, he felt a stirring in his soul, a profound sense that Christ himself was beside him, not in a visible apparition, not in a sound, but in a nearness that overwhelmed him. He placed his quill down, knelt on the cold stone floor, and whispered, "Lord, this is not my work but yours." And then, in deep peace, he returned to writing. Those who later read the Catechism often remarked that certain passages seemed almost luminous with devotion. Many suspected that they were born from that moment of grace. The Catechism, once published, spread rapidly, first throughout Bavaria, then across the German-speaking world. It became, for many, the anchor that steadied their faith amid turmoil. Children memorized it. Priests used it in sermons. Even Protestant ministers read it to understand what the Catholic faith truly taught. For Peter presented doctrine not with hardness, but with warmth. But Peter's mission extended far beyond Ingolstadt. The church needed him in Vienna, a city endangered not only by heresy, but by apathy. The clergy, they were discouraged. The faithful were weary. Many had simply drifted away. When Peter arrived, he immediately felt the heaviness of despair. But he also sensed opportunity. Vienna's cathedral, the great Stephansdom, had grown quiet over the years. Attendance was low, and sermons had become dry. On his first morning, Peter entered alone. The vaulted ceilings echoed with silence. He prayed, asking God to breathe life back into the city. And then he began his work. At dawn, he preached Mass. At midday, he taught theology. In the afternoon, he visited the poor. In the evening, he walked the streets seeking conversations with anyone willing to speak of God. His stamina seemed inhuman. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the life of the city began to change. Confessionals that had stood empty now had lines. Students who had mocked religion found themselves attending his lectures. Even nobles came quietly to hear him preach, slipping into the cathedral behind pillars, hoping not to be noticed. One winter night, during a fierce snowstorm, Peter visited a dying woman in a poor neighborhood. The house had no roof in several places, and freezing wind swept through the rooms. The woman's children huddled together under thin blankets, shivering. Peter sat at her bedside, heard her confession, and prayed with her. And when she could no longer speak, he sang softly an ode he had learned as a boy. The neighbors later said that his voice rose above the storm, filling the broken house with warmth. For that family, that moment became a memory passed down through generations. The night a Jesuit priest brought heaven into a freezing room. Peter's work in Vienna expanded beyond preaching. He was asked to reform a university there as well. Once again, he accepted without complaint. He reorganized the faculty, strengthened philosophical studies, and insisted on rigorous theological training. He knew that if the clergy were weak, the faith of the people would collapse. But under his influence, the university regained its vitality, and a new generation of Catholic leaders emerged. From Vienna, Peter's mission extended into Prague, where the situation was even more dire. Many churches had fallen into disrepair. Monasteries were barely populated. The city seemed spiritually exhausted. Peter arrived with only a few companions. The people were indifferent, even skeptical. Some whispered that he was a papal spy. Others feared he had come to impose harsh reforms. But he won them over not with authority, but with compassion. He visited hospitals, walked through muddy streets to reach remote homes, and spoke gently with those who had abandoned the faith. He listened more than he argued. When he preached, he seemed to speak not at the people but to them directly personally. One day, after a long sermon in a nearly empty church, he stepped outside and found a group of children playing in the courtyard. They had no idea who he was. He sat with them, asked their names, and began telling them stories of Christ. The children laughed, asked questions, and followed him through the streets as though he were a beloved uncle. Soon their parents appeared, curious and surprised. They stood listening. That simple moment, a priest sitting with children in the dirt, sparked a renewed curiosity about the faith. Within months, Peter's sermons drew standing-room-only crowds, and Prague began its slow return to Catholic life. His influence continued to spread. He became known as the Apostle of Germany, not because he performed dramatic miracles, but because he was tireless in love. He founded Jesuit colleges in Freiburg, Innsbruck, Dillingen, Munich, and Lucerne. Each school became a beacon of Catholic renewal. His students admired him not only for his intellect but for his humility. He lived with minimal comforts, often sleeping only a few hours a night, offering the rest of his time to prayer, study, and the care of souls. Despite his gentleness, Peter was fiercely courageous when necessary. He was unafraid to challenge rulers, confront corrupt clergy, or debate theologians trying to tear apart the church. His writings and sermons repeatedly emphasize the principle that would define his approach to the entire Reformation: correct error, but never lose charity; defend the truth, but never humiliate the one who errs. It was a spirit that allowed him to accomplish what others could not. One famous scene reveals this courage clearly. In Augsburg, where Protestant and Catholic tensions ran dangerously high, a prominent Lutheran preacher invited Peter to a public debate. The crowd gathered in the town hall: students, magistrates, merchants, and nobles. Peter entered silently, carrying no notes, while his opponent arrived with stacks of books. The debate began heatedly, but Peter responded with a calmness that unnerved his adversary. His explanations were patient, precise, and rooted deeply in Scripture and early Christian writings. Those present later said that the debate felt less like a contest and more like a man holding a lantern in a dark room. The Lutheran preacher became agitated, raised his voice, and hurled accusations against the church. Peter did not respond in kind. Instead, he addressed the crowd directly, speaking of Christ's unity, the ancient faith, and the need for humility on all sides. The audience fell silent. Even those who disagreed with him felt moved. By the end, many admitted privately that Peter's charity had done more to win their respect than any argument could have. Not all his work was public. He suffered deeply at times, moments of exhaustion, slander, and misunderstanding. Some accused him of political manipulation. Others believed he was too gentle toward Protestants. But Peter never allowed bitterness to take root. He prayed constantly, even during his missions, often for hours before dawn. He once wrote in a private letter that prayer was the furnace in which God melts down the hardness of the world and gives me new heart each morning. His mystical life continued quietly. Those close to him noticed that after receiving Holy Communion, he often fell into profound contemplative silence. Once, during Mass in Innsbruck, a brother saw him remain kneeling long after the liturgy had ended, his face radiant, his breathing slow and peaceful. When gently shaken, Peter seemed awake as from a dream. He never spoke of what he experienced, but his eyes carried the unmistakable expression of one who had touched something divine. The intensity of his work demanded much, and his superiors, seeing the growing needs of the Church in Switzerland, sent him westward to Lucerne and Fribourg. These lands, too, were fractured by religious conflict. Peter entered them as he always did, quietly, humbly, but with unstoppable resolve. His sermons filled churches. His catechism classes shaped the youth. His personal counsel strengthened weary priests who felt the future slipping away. But perhaps his most enduring impact in Switzerland came through his writing. During these years, He produced an expanded version of his catechism, the Great Catechism, a monumental work addressing not only youth but scholars, pastors, and rulers. It became a foundational text of the Catholic Reformation, read in universities and monasteries for generations. By the late 1560s, Peter Canisius had become one of the most influential figures in all of Catholic Europe. He had earned the trust of emperors, bishops, and countless ordinary families. Yet he never sought recognition. When praised, he pointed to God. When thanked, he deflected the honor. When people wonder how he accomplished so much, he simply said that grace makes all things possible. But even a saint's strength is finite. The years of travel, teaching, preaching, fasting, and constant labor began to wear on him. His health wavered at times, though he hid it as best he could. The church still needed him desperately, and he pressed forward, unwilling to rest while souls remained in danger. And so he entered the final great chapter of his life, a chapter marked by both triumph and quiet suffering, by the culmination of decades of labor, and by the beginning of his earthly decline. As Peter entered the last great phase of his mission, the world around him had changed once again. Decades of turmoil had left Germany and Switzerland scarred, but not defeated. Churches had reopened, seminaries had revived, schools flourished under Jesuit care, and in many regions the Catholic faith, once thought doomed, had regained strength and dignity. Yet Peter knew better than anyone that renewal was fragile. It needed shepherds, preachers, teachers, and above all, saints. And so, even as age crept upon him, he refused to slow his pace. His superiors appointed him to Fribourg, Switzerland, in 1580. The city, set among steep green hills and crossed by a river whose waters echoed against the medieval bridges, had long been a stronghold of the faith. But it, too, felt the tremors of division. Protestant ideas had seeped quietly into nearby regions, and indifference threatened to hollow out the spiritual life of the clergy. When Peter arrived, the people welcomed him with warmth, but also with expectation. They had heard the legends. They knew he had been the pillar of Germany, the voice that steadied Vienna, the teacher who rekindled universities. They expected miracles of the heart, and Peter, though humble, felt deeply the responsibility of this final mission. His strength was no longer what it once had been. Traveling long distances left him breathless. Some mornings he rose from his bed with difficulty, clutching his breviary as though leaning on it for balance. But even as his body weakened, something in his soul grew brighter. His sermons became more tender, more filled with longing for Christ, more piercing in their simplicity. People said that when he preached in Fribourg's cathedral, it felt as if he were speaking from a place already halfway into heaven. One story from these years stands out in the memories of those who knew him. A young widow, grieving the sudden death of her husband and tortured by despair, came to see him. She had not eaten or slept properly for days. Peter welcomed her without judgment, listened to her in silence, and then, with extraordinary gentleness, spoke of Christ's companionship with the suffering. He did not offer philosophical explanations or stern admonitions. He offered sympathy, prayer, and the assurance that God had not forgotten her. When she left his presence, she later wrote, "I felt as though the weight on my chest had been lifted by invisible hands." For her, that moment marked the beginning of healing. Peter also devoted himself to the training of clergy. He saw clearly that the church's revival depended on priests who were educated, devout, and courageous. He founded a Jesuit college in Fribourg that would become famous throughout Switzerland. He wrote tirelessly sermons, letters, devotional texts, refined editions of his catechisms. Even now, his pen never rested long. His later writings carry a tenderness and depth that earlier works, for all their brilliance, had not fully possessed. His letters overflow with encouragement, urging bishops not to give in to fear, urging young Jesuits to remain faithful in obscurity, urging lay people to cling to prayer even when they felt abandoned by God. He wrote as one who knew suffering and who understood the mystery of perseverance. But behind these outward works lay an inner life even more profound. Peter's prayer deepened as age drew him closer to eternity. He often rose in the middle of the night to kneel in the chapel, remaining in silence for hours. Those who happened to see him said he prayed like a man absorbed entirely in God. Sometimes, after receiving the Eucharist, he remained motionless for so long that brothers hesitated to disturb him. Once, when gently touched, he opened his eyes with a look of unearthly peace, as though he had just returned from speaking directly with Christ. He rarely spoke of mystical experiences, but one episode has been preserved in his own handwriting. He described a moment of prayer in which he felt the presence of the Virgin Mary with indescribable sweetness. It was not a vision of the senses, but a consolation of the soul, a sense that she stood beside him, interceding for him, strengthening him. He wrote afterward, "She did not speak in words, yet I understood her as clearly as if she had. She urged me to persevere and promised her assistance in my final years." This experience became a source of strength he relied upon quietly and continually. In 1583, Peter suffered a near-fatal stroke. He lost the ability to walk and speak clearly. For a man who had been so tirelessly active, preaching across cities, founding schools, reforming universities, writing until late hours, the sudden stillness was severe trial. But he accepted it with humility. He told his brothers, "If God wishes me to serve him now by suffering, then let me suffer." Slowly, with great difficulty, he regained enough strength to preach again, though never with the vigor of his youth. His final great labor came in the form of his last and most polished catechetical works. The original catechism had spread widely, but Peter felt called to refine it further for different audiences: children, students, scholars. Even when he could no longer stand without assistance, he continued to write, dictating passages from his bed in a voice weakened but unwavering in conviction. These catechisms, especially the Summa Doctrinae Christiani, became foundational texts for Catholic education for centuries. In German-speaking lands, they were said to have shaped the faith as deeply as Luther's writings had shaped Protestantism, but with charity rather than division, with clarity rather than polemic. Despite declining health, Peter insisted on hearing confessions when he could. People traveled miles, sometimes days, to speak with him. They found in him a priest who could see beneath the surface of their words, who understood human fear and longing with unusual compassion. Even when he could barely raise his hand, he managed to give absolution. Those who came to him often said they left feeling as though they had been touched by something holy. One winter in Fribourg, a terrible epidemic swept through the surrounding villages. Priests were exhausted, overwhelmed by the number of sick and dying. Though he could barely walk, Peter begged his brothers to take him to the worst affected areas. They resisted, fearing the journey would kill him, but he insisted, saying, "If the Lord will grant me the strength to comfort his suffering children, how can I refuse him?" They carried him by cart to the villages, where he prayed beside the dying, blessed infants, heard confessions, and spoke softly to grieving families. His presence brought courage in the darkest hours. By the mid-1590s, his strength was nearly gone, yet he continued to guide the Jesuit community in Fribourg with fatherly affection. He encouraged younger Jesuits to trust in God rather than in their own abilities. He reminded them that intellect must always bow before charity, and that the renewal of the Church would come not through brilliance alone, but through holiness lived quietly and faithfully. His thoughts turned increasingly toward heaven. He spent long afternoons in silent contemplation, gazing at the crucifix or reading the Psalms. Sometimes he muttered prayers under his breath, unaware that others were listening. Brothers who cared for him said that even in his exhaustion, he radiated a peace that seemed to come from beyond this world. As his final illness began to take hold, those around him noticed a deep stillness in his soul, not resignation, but readiness. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried gentle wisdom. To a young Jesuit troubled about the future, he said, "Do what you can with love, and God will do what you cannot." To a priest who feared a rise of heresy, he replied, "Truth does not tremble. Only hearts do. Strengthen hearts, and truth will prevail." In his last weeks, he could no longer walk or write. His hands shook, his speech slurred, but his eyes remained bright. He received Holy Communion daily when possible, often with tears glistening on his face. His brothers noticed that after communion he would fall into deep prayer, his breathing soft and measured, as if he were already halfway in eternity. On December 20th, 1597, sensing that death approached, the community gathered around him. The room was quiet except for the sound of breathing and the soft crackle of a fire. A crucifix hung on the wall opposite his bed. Peter looked at it with tenderness. He had spent his entire life drawing others to the heart of Christ, and now he prepared to surrender his own. A brother asked whether he wished to send any final message to the Jesuit order. Peter shook his head weakly and whispered, "Love and follow Christ." They were among his last coherent words. As the day faded, he fell into a peaceful sleep. His breathing slowed. The brothers prayed around him, reciting the litany of the saints, the Hail Mary, the Salve Regina. And then, with no struggle, no fear, he breathed his last. Peter Canisius died quietly, without fanfare, in the very city he had served with such humility and perseverance. The Church mourned deeply, for a pillar of her strength had been taken from the world. But there was also a profound sense of victory, not the triumph of armies or kingdoms, but the triumph of the soul who had spent itself entirely for God. In time, the world would come to understand the magnitude of his life. Millions would learn the faith from his catechisms. Universities he revitalized would shape generations. Regions he restored would remain Catholic for centuries. And his example, the unwavering charity, the clarity of mind, the devotion to Christ, will become a model for priestly life in every age. The Church eventually declared him a doctor, placing him among the greatest teachers in Christian history. But his true legacy does not lie in titles or honors. It lies in the countless souls who found faith through him, in the parishes he revived, in the courage he gave to the weary, and in the quiet holiness that sustained him to the end. He lived at a time when the world seemed to be falling apart, yet he responded not with fear, but with fidelity. And by the time he left it, the world he touched had begun to heal.